I'm David Pinsoff,
I'm David Pietrzewski.
and this is Evolutionary Psychology, the podcast, which
Actual
features.
evolutionary psychology
That's right.
by actual evolutionary psychologists.
That's right.
So,
Uh,
yeah.
Enjoy.
David, today we have another episode of this podcast.
Yes, and it is about the thing that we are doing right now, which is communicating.
Oh, right. I'm aware that I'm communicating to other people and I'm behaving in a certain way because I'm aware that other people well, yeah, it gets complicated.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you're doing a poor job of it, but and
Thank you.
normally humans do a good job of this thing called communication, and we evaluate the things that other people say based on how relevant it is to the goals that we're pursuing, and it's about shaping what's inside your head based on what I think, you think, I think. It gets very complicated very quickly,
It
but thankfully
does.
we have
Tom
a wonderful
Scott-Phillips.
guest.
Yes,
Yes,
Tom
Thom
Scott-Phillips.
Scott-Phillips,
Yeah, who
and
really knows a lot about communication. And I think it is like a Alice in Wonderland situation where I think I understand language and what it is, or like how grammar works. And then Tom comes and says sort of things, and I'm like, whoa, that's very different the way I think. And by the end, I'm sort of convinced that there's one needs to sort of understand things quite a bit differently. And so we talk about all kinds of interesting things like art and how that works, what grammar is, whether or not grammar or language is sort of quote unquote innate, all kinds of different things.
yep, and we even get into dancing at toward the end, and also
Mm.
whether non-evolutionary psychology is possible.
Oh, right. Yeah. And Lindy Hop, fans of Lindy Hop, or if you feel things about the Lindy Hop or dancing in general, stay tuned.
You could even dance to the episode if you feel so inclined.
Oh, yeah. Or for the next little segment of
Oh yeah,
music.
dance to the music. It's pretty danceable. It's got a beat.
It does. Yeah. Okay.
All
Sounds
right,
good.
well,
All right. We'll see you in a
and
second.
see ya.
Today we have a very wonderful, very special guest, Thom Scott-Phillips. Really nice to have you here. And Tom, I've been thinking a lot about what to say about you as a guest, but I actually wanted to start with one thing, which is this paper called "Expression Unleashed" that you did with Christoph Heinz, and this paper, and then I think you have another paper that's about museums. Is that right? Or ostensive
I have a
communication.
paper about it's called the art experience,
Oh, right.
the experience of going to modern art museums and how it
Yeah.
helps
Yeah.
evolutionary
And
adaptive
so,
communication. Yeah.
yeah. And so there's, for me, like I have a running list of like, and actually David is one of these people, like people who have actually like taught me something, um, which is sort of meta because a lot of your work is about like people should say relevant things and they learn something. And if they say something that you learn from, you'll listen to them. So hopefully you're listening to this podcast because you're learning something too. And if not, I'm sorry, and you should listen to something else. I shouldn't have said that. We should cut that out. But but I think like this expression, at least paper and this art paper really taught me something about the life in the world. And like whenever we have somebody on, I think about what I think about the person. And for me, I have a little cartoon bubble, which is like ostensive communication for you.
Mm.
And for those, I think what you study is really interesting, but it's also really subtle. It's kind of like theory of mind. Like the first time I heard theory of mind, I was like, why do you even need a system for that? Because it's so obvious we attribute mental states, the idea there's a mechanism for that. And I think communication, and especially like ostensive communication, is so obvious. It's so baked into us and who we are that there's so much instinct blindness. And Dave and I talked about instinct blindness. Can you talk about and can you like disabuse us of our instinct blindness? What is ostensive communication? And just sort of just as a bedrock here of sort of why do we need something like that?
Yeah. So there's many ways to answer this question, and if you let me talk, I'll probably talk for 2 hours. So you have to stop me at some point.
That's great. Yeah.
So here's how I think about it these days. I think the useful analogy is with locomotion. So locomotion is a super basic biological task. Maybe not all, but almost all organisms have to do it in one way or another. But there's more than one way of doing it in the world. So some organisms swim, some walk, some fly, some crawl, and so on. You can taxonomize those different ways, those different modes, in a few different ways, arguably. We take communication to be a basic, it's communication. It's an uncontroversial concept. We don't have to say anything more. I don't think that's true. I think communication comes in more than one variety. And I think in particular, what humans do is a distinctive variety. I mean, all species have things that they do that are distinctive by definition, otherwise they wouldn't be species. And one of the things that humans do is they communicate in a particular way, which the jargon is, as you say, ostensive communication. And what that means in particular is that human communication is predicated on expressing and recognizing mental states. So the naive notion of communication is, what computers do. So sometimes called the code model or a conduit metaphor. You've got some information, you put it in a box, you send it along a channel, maybe there's some information loss, and you've got a decoding mechanism. And as long as the encoding and the decoding mechanisms are calibrated to one another, then you can unpack it at the other end and so on. And that's what computers do.
And just to
sometimes
clarify,
people,
like all the information is in that packet, sort of, right?
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
even the word information
Yeah,
is
yeah,
a
of course. Yeah,
metaphor because information is not a
yeah.
physical thing that you can put in
Right.
anything. But yeah, it's all there, and there are benefits. That's a simple. Clearly, that's not in everything to say about language use. Just to take the most obvious example, but it's sometimes useful to think about human communication in those terms. But it also has its limits because it's a metaphor, and humans are not just encoding, decoding machines.
Right.
And thinking about what humans do is expressing and recognizing mental states, and then seeing all the stuff, whether it's gestures or pointing or pantomime or language use, as ways of expressing and recognizing mental states. That's the sort of the inversion that I think the evolutionary perspective brings to light.
Right. And just to make it concrete, like I would just imagine like a mother and a child at the zoo, and they walk up to a cage and the mother points and says, there.
Yeah.
Right. And if you take like if you built a robot and it was just sort of like it encoded the word there, that's just an information about like a location, right?
Absolutely.
There's nothing more about that. And so reading in the natural thing we all do, which is that there is the animal. The reason why we're here is to see animals. I'm pointing there, and the most relevant reason to point to a location is that there's an animal and you don't know where it is. And so like all of that stuff that we so effortlessly read into, if you try to build a robot to do it, is really, really hard.
Absolutely.
And then also that means that what language is, if I understand what you're saying, Tom, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is like the real thing about communication is the thing that people actually say is super sparse. Like you've ever read a transcript of communication, it's like almost impossible to understand what's being talked about, especially if there's no context or pragmatic cues. And so it's such minimal information, but it's just enough to tip and activate all the mental state attribution and intention. Is that sort of what you're saying? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's one way of glossing what I'm saying. I mean,
Yeah.
there's much more under the surface, but yes.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, good. You go, David. Yeah.
Is what you're saying basically that human communication requires a sophisticated theory of mind or ability to model others' mental states, and communication to some extent, or at least human style communication, cannot occur without a recognition of mental states, and maybe communication takes place in other organisms, and maybe they don't have the requisite theory of mind, and that would be a different kind of communication. But human communication is always embedded in a set of representations about what you're thinking, what you're intending, what I'm thinking that you're thinking that I'm thinking, and so forth. And you cannot understand language outside of that socially situated context.
I think that's absolutely right. And
Okay.
so one common objection to let's raise and deal with a common objection to this way of thinking about what's going on with human communication, which is surely you don't think that David's example, mother goes to the zoo and the small child, and you think that the child is inferring what the mother might be intending about the child's mental states. And actually, when getting into the details, it's even more complicated than that. There's many layers. I think that objection is misplaced. So in another recent paper, Christoph found this, my co-author, he found this beautiful quote going back a few hundred years to do with Descartes and Berkeley and theory of vision.
Mm.
So around that time, they've got this idea of light waves, going through the lens and hitting the back of the eye, and people saying, well, okay, that makes some sense, but then how could you see distance if that's how vision is working, right? How does depth perception work? And Descartes' answer is you don't have one perspective, you have two perspectives, right? You have two
Mm.
eyes, and with two
Nice.
eyes, you can triangulate.
Descartes banger, as David would say, banger philosopher.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you've got two
Sorry, Dave.
perspectives, and you can triangulate between them. And his contemporaries, there's a quote from George Berkeley, who's a pretty well-known philosopher of the time, that says, this is madness,
Yeah.
because there's no way you're telling me that ordinary people are doing trigonometry in their
Yeah.
heads every time they look around the world. Like
Yeah.
maybe educated people can do this, but the man on the street cannot do this.
Yeah.
That was the argument, the counter argument to Descartes at the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
And I think what's going, as you started this conversation, descriptively, what's going on in human communication is hugely complex. Vision science is complex. The study of human communication is complex, but phenomenologically, it's utterly trivial.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting fact. But I don't think the fact that it's phenomenologically simple means that we need to have simple explanations of the underlying cognitive processes.
Yeah, that's like basically the summary of like why cognitive science and psychology have sort of struggled is super strong priors that
Yes.
the way it feels corresponds to how it works. And we've talked a lot about that on this podcast. And yeah, no, for sure. Marvin Minsky had this, thing where he talked about the history of AI. And AI started with what seemed like really difficult things like college level math. And the AI was doing great on this in chess and checkers. And they're like, okay, buckle up, everybody. We're going to have robots in like a day. And then they started to do things like vision and just
Yeah.
seeing blocks and just how hard that was and how when the blocks were rotated, the lighting was different. It became really, really hard. And even to this day, like with as good as like all these like, robots that are being built for hopefully not killing people, but probably mainly are, they're still not very good at like even object recognition and the things that like basically his argument was that the things that feel easy are really hard and the things that seem hard are easy. Because in terms of like the mechanics, because the difference between sort of like building blocks or like walking around and navigating the world, these are things that have had a super long evolutionary history. There's a ton of R&D from natural selection, and then the little bit of variation, like can you do math better than me? It's actually computationally trivial, but it's just something we didn't evolve to do. And so, like the things that we take for granted, like communication, like walking around and seeing and recognizing objects, finding a joke funny, like actually requires a lot of common sense knowledge about the world and like, per David's theory of humor. And so no, that's exactly right. I think like what you're describing like summarizes the history of like why we failed is we've not allowed there to be enough space and room for theories of complexity and things that feel simple.
Speculating a little bit on the examples you just gave, it strikes me that the ones that AI finds easy are ones which involve a degree of abstraction from the physical and the social world.
Yeah.
Right? Mathematics.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. The symbols are strict.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. But the things that involve navigating a physical world, or even harder, navigating a social world with bodies in it, that is a really complicated task, and we're at the beginning, frankly.
Mm-hmm. Totally. One wonderful way that you have changed my perspective is on the nature of grammar and language acquisition. So I sort of saw myself as a Chomskyan just kind of by default because, oh, I'm an evolutionary psychologist. The Chomskyan view is that, language is an adaptation and it must be innate to some degree. I bought into the Pinker language instinct argument. And I just assumed, yeah, obviously, we have innate hardware, we have an innate grammar, and that allows us to speak language. But reading you disabused me of that perspective and made me realize that no, grammar doesn't have to be innate. It probably isn't. It's probably better understood as a byproduct. And language itself may not even be that clearly delineated as an adaptation in its own right, as opposed to lying on a continuum with other kinds of social conventions and social norms. and social cognition more broadly. And so that was a really cool perspective shift for me. I'm curious where you stand on the perennial debate, between Chomsky and the others. How quote unquote innate is language? Do you take that to be a serious question or not? Where do you situate yourself in the linguistics debate?
Yeah, definitely a serious question. And it's an enormous one that's taken up the time of many, many careers. So I'll try and do it in a few minutes.
You have two
Uh,
minutes, Tom. 2 minutes.
right. Okay.
I'm starting right now. So
So yeah, so Chomsky has, a well-known view that he would say language, it might be better characterized as syntactic structure of some kind or another, is innate.
Mhm.
And Pinker, along with Paul Bloom, who was a relatively junior colleague at the time in 1990, they published a very influential paper, Natural Language and Natural Selection. Where well, I should have given a bit more context. Chomsky believes there's something innate, but is pretty hostile to adaptationist perspectives
Right.
on
Yeah.
on the mind in general. And he speculated through the 80s that perhaps it's incidental chance mutation. We can't really know too much about it. There's not much point to the speculation. And Pinker, being on the one hand a Chomskyan, but on the other hand an evolutionary psychologist, publishes this paper that says no, there's no contradiction here. You can believe both things at the same time. And yeah, so I started when I started my PhD 15 years after that, I was definitely an adaptationist. Part of my origin story, I've listened to your other podcasts, and part of my
Mhm.
origin story is
Yeah.
involves some similar stories. And I was an adaptationist partly because of Pinker, partly because of other popularizers.
Mhm.
Uh, but I wanted to be precise about what I meant by language, and it's a very, very slippery concept. What is this
Mhm.
thing that is supposed to have to be designed in some way or another?
Mhm.
And I ended up actually finding, adaptationist perspectives to be of use when thinking more broadly about communication. And so for many years, like 15 years really, I was agnostic about the questions you're asking me about, David, like the
Mhm.
nature of grammar. And I was
Yeah.
writing, thinking, researching much more on communication and its many manifestations. There's aspects of children's development. It connects to things like commitment, to art theory. It connects to lots of domains. But only recently, in the last 5 years or so, I've started thinking more about grammar, and I've been persuaded by the arguments of those who disagree with the Chomskys and the Pinkers of the world.
Mhm.
So now I'm going to oversimplify, and many linguists are going to hate this oversimplification. But on the one side, you can put what you could call words and rules approaches, which is what generative grammar would be. So you have words and you have rules for combining them, and you have some
Mhm.
awareness of which rules you know are allowed and which ones are not, and so on.
Mhm.
And the other side is an approach, some commonly called construction grammar. There's a lot more under the surface, but the basic idea is that there's a single unit. There's a foundation of languages, which is called constructions. And constructions can be concrete, they can be words, but they can also be quite abstract. So my go-to example is like, what's X doing Y? What's Tom doing with that girl? What's this fly doing in my soup? What's David doing chatting to John, right? And you
Mhm.
can put another construction inside the empty slots, inside the X and the Y.
Mhm.
And that construction allows you to ask for a resolution of some incongruity. It has a function. So all constructions are mappings between a form and a function and some communicative function. And in that
Mhm.
way, you using language is throwing constructions together
Mhm.
and throwing all these these micro functions together.
Tom, one
So
quick question is that
yeah,
Minsky had this idea of frames. Is that sort of related to that?
maybe can I come to that in a moment?
Please, yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So because I'm going to come back around to David's question.
great.
So that way of that constructionist approach, the work I've done recently pairs that with the adaptationist approach to communication. And the argument I'm developing is that constructions are conventions for doing the adaptive task that human communication is designed to do, which is expressing and revealing intentions. So all
Mhm.
this stuff in grammar are cultural conventions that we've built as communities that allow us to do the expression and recognition of mental states much more easily, much more efficaciously, much more micro precision than we otherwise would
Mhm.
do.
I
Otherwise, we
want to
just have bodies and we'd be pointing
I
and stuff, but we can be
I want to
micro.
unpack just the depth of that idea because I see it as kind of a mind-blowing idea.
Okay, well,
This idea that grammar is not innate, but is a set of social conventions. So, where we situate the verb and the noun and the adjective, these are social conventions that are essentially no different from driving on the same side of the road, or, saying bless you when a person sneezes,
Yeah.
working from 9 to 5, using the metric system. These are all part of the same category of social conventions that allow us to mutually benefit from interacting with each other. And In the same way that social conventions differ across cultures, grammars might differ across cultures. Is that basically the idea that you're proposing?
Yes. The short answer is yes. The longer answer is yes, but.
Hmm.
So yes, that's all right. There is a key difference, and that is that by using these conventions in this communicative way,
Hmm.
and this is a Pinkeresque thing to say. It's so obviously powerful, useful. It completely changes the nature of an organ, that species' existence. That
Hmm.
it's not a surprise that there'll be downstream adaptations to do this more efficaciously. Now, those downstream adaptations don't need to be the structure of syntax. I don't see
Hmm.
any particular reason for that, but they will be an enhanced memory for constructions. We all know to know a
Yeah.
language is to know a vast number of constructions,
Hmm.
um, all sorts of computational capacities that enable us to use them very far, to pick up on them, to produce them extremely fast, instantaneously. And also things involved in interaction, like fine-grained precision or fine-grained sensitivity to timing and contingency in interaction. There's pauses, all that sort of stuff. Maybe even the white layer of the eye, so you can catch people's attention more easily. Fine-grained control of the motor apparatus of hands and the mouth. There's lots of stuff that enables us to do these tasks. Well, once we're doing it linguistically, we'll then do it linguistically a very finely designed way. It's a very Darwinian thing to say.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
sort
and
of just
that's not true of driving on the left-hand side of the road, right?
Right.
That's
I see.
yeah.
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 So just like to understand, it's the idea is that sort of like the fact that there's open parameters. So it could be that it could be like, for example, this is how you get sign language, right? Where the fact that it's with our hands, the machinery for sort of these are the conventions or these are the things that stand for this communicative intent that's an open parameter. So it's not specific to like one modality. And that openness is itself evidence, if I understand the claim, that it's this higher level sort of point system that then has concomitant adaptations. Is that fair?
That I don't know if I completely follow. That
Okay.
may be a good gloss of
Yeah.
what I'm saying. I'll try and put it in different words, and you can tell me if it's
Yeah.
similar. So humans, when they communicate, they can use any like anything they have, right? I could use this banana if I wanted to make a certain point. I am actually
Morse
right.
code. We could tap on, yeah, we could
We,
tap on a
we can
desk
use
or
our
something.
bodies. We can
Yeah.
point. We can do it in an improvised way. If my mouth is full because I'm chewing and my arms are full,
Yeah.
I might point with my nose or something. We
You're
can use it.
describing my time in Germany not speaking
Right,
German.
there we
Yeah,
go. Yeah.
exactly.
So
I mean,
we
my,
can
my
use
mouth
it.
was full of pretzels and sausage when I was in Germany. So yeah,
So we can use anything. It just so happens that if you share a language with someone, then the most convenient thing to use isn't a part of my body. It's shared knowledge of a convention,
Yeah.
or a whole world of conventions, and
Yeah.
that's just what we happen to have to hand. But it can be, and those conventions. If you're using spoken language, those conventions are spoken, but they can be gestural as well if you're using sign language. Yeah.
Yeah, can I just like push on this because I think people might have like questions, and so let me just sort of push on this a little bit. So like one question is sort of what work is the idea of constructions doing? So what exactly does that mean? And if there is design for basically what people might intuitively think of as like language in the downstream, does that amount to the same claim that language is an adaptation? And then what is up with like things like over regularization? Like kids say goad, and nobody has taught them to do that. So this is part of this argument that kids are learning rules of grammar.
Yeah. So a construction it's a very old idea in language science, blossomed in the last 30 years or so. It's an old idea. It's a mapping between a form and a function. Right? And as I said earlier, I gave a few examples, words, and what's X doing Y. It can be even more abstract. So subject, verb, object, transitive actions, and you just plug other things in. And the complicated sentences have all sorts of constructions plugged into one another and interacting with one another. Um,
Right.
and their functions are complementary. The functions are working with it of the each individual construction is working together to build up the meaning
Right.
sentence.
Now, is the idea that those construction systems evolve for other functions, and that's why language is not an adaptation?
So
Or like,
those constructions are all conventions. The word banana is nothing more than a conventional way that you and I have to raise the salience of objects like this.
right.
If
But this,
I, if I
what I
want to
mean is
bring
like
this
the
into common
machinery
ground,
for, sorry, like the example you gave where there's sort of like why X is X or
what's X
something
doing
like
Y? Yeah,
what's X doing Y. The machinery that represents that is
yeah.
the idea that that machinery was for some other function. It
Oh, so
evolved because you need them in that machinery in order for
uh,
all that content to get plugged
I'm
in.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'm suggesting that the machinery to host form function pairs and to indeed not just to host some, but a vast number of them and to plug them together. Yeah, that to me is most plausibly explained as an adaptation to the fact that humans are a linguistic species. So
Okay.
we become a
I see. I
we
see.
become a
Okay.
communicative species. Humans, they develop conventions super fast.
Got it.
Once they're using conventions regularly, they're gonna, the world, the ecology, the social ecology has changed. There's going to be selection and pressure on using those conventions quickly, easily, fine-grained manner. So you get selection for the capacity to host an enormous number.
Right. So
Yeah.
there are the ideas that the language communication system, there are evolved structures, but they're much more compositional than this old view.
The word composition was a tricky one.
Okay.
So the extent in which what you're saying is true, but composition was a tricky word within linguistics. It has a bunch of overlapping and not all the same meanings.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
I'm a bit. I can hear the linguists in the background.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
sure, sure,
just
sure.
give
Yeah,
you a
there's a lot
straight
of
yes,
audiences. Yeah,
but
yeah.
roughly yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the way I sort of think of your work is situated in a larger trend where we've sort of gone from this view as man, the rational animal, that
Yeah.
we're solitary, intelligent thinkers, that we just puzzle things out individually in our heads, and so it used to be thought that the reason why human brains were so big is so that we could reason and use tools and figure things out. Um, and increasingly, the more popular and I think more plausible, given the evidence, view is that really it's better to think of humans not as the rational animal or as the intelligent animal, but as the social animal. And so one of the biggest predictors of primate brain size is not whether they use tools or something like that. It's how big their group is, what the social challenges there are in the primates environment. And humans have extremely large groups, extremely complicated social environments. Probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest, causes of human brain expansion was just the immensely complicated social lives that we have to navigate. There's, of course, recent work by Hugo Mercier arguing that reasoning, our ability to think through syllogisms, if P then Q, that this faculty did not evolve for helping us make better decisions or think more rationally. It evolved in a social context. It evolved to help us convince other people who we might have conflicts of interest with and justify our behaviors in a way that might defend our reputations. And so even, reasoning, this sort of quintessentially solitary rational thing, is actually a deeply social thing. And I see what you're doing with language is very much analogous, where it used to be believed that language is about transmitting a piece of information from one head to another, so that we could all understand the world more accurately. And so I'm sending you the code. You have to decode my code so that you understand the world around us. But you're basically taking that view and saying, no, we have to understand this as being situated within our social niche, and view it as not necessarily transmitting information, but trying to get inside another person's head, and get inside their head, getting inside your head, and in many ways trying to manipulate what's inside their head for your advantage, or to mutually manipulate the contents of each other's head for mutual advantage. So that's sort of how I see your work. Would you buy that overarching
Absolutely.
framework? Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
absolutely. So, you know, what if I can find the time and the space to do it, one of my ambitions for the future is to, you know, maybe a special issue, maybe that, I mean, I think there's much work to do getting the people, the sorts of names you just mentioned together
Yeah.
and articulating in detail the idea of social mind. So it's,
Mhm.
I mean, you mentioned Hugo Messier and his work on reasoning. There's plenty of work these days on emotions as well. Some of emotions which were historically called what are they called?
Self-conscious.
Self-conscious, thank you. Yeah,
Mm.
self-conscious
Mhm.
emotions have
Yeah.
been rethought as social adaptations. There's
Yep.
a guy who did his PhD at CEU, at Central European University, called Johannes Maar, and he's
Mhm.
done work on episodic memory, so
Mhm.
remembering events and making arguments a lot to the effect that that is we do that not in order to sort of recall the past for our own internal purposes, but so that we can act well in future cases of persuasion and argumentation and managing social relations. Um, I think, yeah, I do think that most, I don't know if it's all, but certainly a very large amount of what's distinctive about our species comes down to the complexity and the size of our social groups.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Let me just try one more different tack to make sure I understand. So, bringing back to Minsky, one of Minsky's criticisms of Chomsky. So, Chomsky, the sort of narrative is, sort of started the cognitive revolution. And I'm a big fan of Chomsky. I mean, everybody, huge contribution in arguing that this is part of our natural endowment, it's part of our species, typical, readily developing stuff. It's just part of our biological endowment, like a trunk or a trunk in an elephant or something. And that was really controversial, really important. But Minsky's argument was Chomsky, by sort of starting the cognitive revolution, in contrast to the behaviorists, right? Chomsky was arguing with Skinner. It was a great that
Yes.
review is a great thing to read, by the way. Chomsky's criticism of Skinner. Um, Minsky's argument is that what Skinner did was actually behaviorism, because what Chomsky was doing still at the end of the day was sort of giving people sentences and asking them to say, is this grammatical or not? And it was sort of the latent structure of what theories are necessary to explain the behavior of people saying this is grammatical or not. And Minsky's argument is that misses the entire hard problem of whether it's grammatical, it doesn't matter at all. What matters is exactly what you're describing, Tom, which is sort of the communication. And I think like the Minsky's frames, and this is why like, thinking about this is like Minsky's idea about frames, which is like from the 70s, which was just that
Mm.
these are different sort of like cribs or ontologies for sort of like, it's almost like this form structure thing where it'd be sort of like there's a frame for sort of like physical transitions. So like an occlusion event, right? That when occlusion is detected,
Oh,
there's a system for representing what happens. Like
I
it's
see.
and there's cues for detecting occlusion. There's frames for temporal changes, and so Minsky's claim is that we have all of these frames that are sort of what make our ability to do things like navigate a room. Like if you
Yeah.
don't represent occlusion, all of a sudden you're just like, oh my God, like, the hallway isn't that out there. I would never go to the hallway, right? Like if I never thought it was still there. And so all this machinery for representing things like the passage of time, what happens when an event, a physical event happens, what
Mm.
happens when a social event, in his argument was the hard part of um, communication. And what communication really is the communication or getting people coordinated about the content and frames that are being activated. And it almost sounds like maybe Thom Scott-Phillips is sort of picking up the Chomsky, or sorry, the Minsky. I meant
Minsky,
Minsky.
yeah.
The Minsky claim, is that sort of fair?
Maybe I have not read Minsky since I was a grad student,
Okay,
sometime,
yeah.
many years ago now. Maybe, but you've persuaded me that I should go back to that because
Okay,
that
great. Yeah.
what you're saying sounds a lot, yes, similar lines to what I'm saying.
That's
Yeah.
fantastic. Okay, so now I understand it. Thank you. Sorry for yeah, it's wonderful. So
I mean, it
yeah.
may be the case. I'd need to do my reading to check, but it may be that one can understand a construction uh, as a frame of a very specified kind.
Exactly. And I think this is a good example of science where like what do different scientists mean by different
Yeah,
words?
yeah,
We
yeah,
even you and I, as close as we are, Tom, like there's just we have
yeah.
different reading histories, and so yeah, this
Of
is
course.
this is great. Yeah, good.
Should we get into art?
Oh,
Please.
sure. If you so wish. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
My
So
thing with art. So
mm,
this thing, let me just like fill this in, and you please
mhm.
talk about it. It's like I always found it weird like you go into a place and there's like nothing on the walls. And then there's like an object in a glass case, you know? And being an anthropologist about like human existence, I was always like, that's weird. And it really makes this thing seem like important. And I would always like, and this idea of like, you pop a urinal to make the point. But it always struck me as sort of weird, but I never went further than that. And then this paper on art was amazing to me. Can you sort of tell people who haven't read the paper or even who have, can you remind them sort of like, what is this thing about art? Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, the paper itself is called The Art Experience, and I should immediately give credit to the first author, Kate McCallum. She definitely led the work. So I work with mostly, not entirely, but when I think about human communication, I work with a framework that's commonly called relevance theory. And one of the central ideas in relevance theory is that what audiences do when they pick up on a communicative stimulus, or technically an ostensive stimulus, as we talked about earlier, when they pick up on ostensive stimulus, well, your basic problem is what does this thing mean? What is this thing doing in the world? How can, there's an infinite number of things someone might mean by this. And the answer to that question is you assume that it's the most relevant thing that the communicator could have done, given what they want to do to your mind and given all the communicative tools available to them. And there's a lot packed into that, but the essential idea is we are predisposed as audience when we pick up on the fact that some agent has brought our attention to some stimulus in the world, then we presume that it's especially relevant for us, given what they want to do. And our job is essentially as audiences, and we do it, it's spontaneous. You can't turn it off even if you want to. So if you think about film spoilers, someone can tell you they're about to spoil the film that you don't want them to spoil, and you can't turn off your comprehension process. You will interpret on the basis of a presumption of relevance, even though you don't want to. And what we think is that that's essentially what's going on in certainly contemporary art galleries. So they're these white cubes, these white walls, high ceilings, and so on, quite commonly. And then, as you say, something is presented, it draws your attention, it's there for a reason, it's there for
Right.
you in some sense. And so by being there for you, it triggers that search for some notion of some interpretations that are worth processing. The
Right.
interesting thing about art, so think of a continuum. Language is somewhere in the middle, or maybe it's slightly towards one side. Even further down, even more precise. We use these constructions in very precise ways. For example, when we do mathematics, right? It's hyper precise, and that's what at the other extreme. You can raise expectations of relevance, but not provide much guidance
Right.
about exactly what it is your audience should take away. And I think that's what good artists do. They produce stimuli that if they're put on the white wall, and then if you engage with them,
Mm.
presuming that they're relevant in some way, and you search for some interpretation, what I take away may be very different to what you take away. But whoever it is that comes into contact with it takes something away. And that's the skill of a modern artist,
Right.
to produce something that, when it's engaged within those terms, produces something worthwhile for the audience.
That's interesting. I mean, would you view it as sort of analogous to a game? So we can think of games as sort of practicing our cognitive skills. If you're doing a word search, you're practicing your visual
Mm.
search abilities. If you're playing, a physical sport, you're practicing how to maneuver your body through space or throw a projectile or whatever. And these are presumably, useful skills to be able to practice. If you play wrestling, that's going to be really important for in the future if you get into a fight. So it could be that, since language is such an important skill for us to master, that we get pleasure from practicing it. And it
Well,
could be that art is one way of practicing the skill of trying to infer someone's intentions when they might otherwise be opaque or uncertain. So you could think of art as a kind of challenge where like the artist is presenting you with something. You know that they're presenting you with something, and you know that it's going to be relevant in some way. Otherwise, they wouldn't be putting it in front of you. And the puzzle that you're trying to solve is, well, why? Why are they putting this in front of
yeah.
me? What are they trying to tell me? And there's a kind of pleasure we get in playing that game and practicing our ability to do that kind of detective work of, what is the meaning of this stimulus? Would you buy that lens?
Yeah, I like that. I haven't thought about art in terms of puzzles and games, but I quite like that. And it reminds me of if you read, a popular book that's sort of how to navigate an art gallery, it's
Hmm.
plenty of people interested and find the world a bit opaque. And it's
Hmm.
very common advice to almost verbalize for yourself, what do I see? And I remember doing
Hmm.
this myself, well, in my early 20s and looking at going to big art galleries and being a bit confused, but just trying to like say to myself, okay, that's there, this is connected to that. And by doing that, I suppose it's practice in a way. I I found I enjoyed modern art more and more the
Mm,
more I did
yeah.
that. So that meshes with what you're saying, yeah.
And it's a beautiful illustration of the fact that language is on a continuum with many different kinds of
Absolutely. Yes.
communication. So just as the words I'm saying can communicate information about my intentions and motives and beliefs, the paintings on my wall are also a similar
Absolutely.
are directly analogous to the words coming out of my mouth in terms of it's trying to send certain signals to you about the kind of person I am. And so viewing, looking at a painting as kind of linguistic in terms of the exercise, I think is an insightful way of understanding what communication is, and that it's not just words and their direct meanings, but it's much more nuanced and rich than that.
Yeah, and there's two things to say. So one is that when we wrote the paper, Kate was very keen, whenever we came close to saying anything like what you did, to be careful because there's a history of people saying, oh, you know, art is like a language. And that history involves people talking too much about codes and thinking the meanings are encoded in the artwork. And
Hmm.
that's not a well-received view in art theory. And
Hmm.
as you know, we have a different take on what's going on in language. And as you say, there's a continuum. I mean, it's clearly a multidimensional space. Humans have cognitive adaptations to express and recognize intentions, and they do this in all sorts of ways. By far the most salient is language use, but there's many others. And taxonomizing that space of the different ways we do things, um, that's work that hasn't been done. I'd love to do it. And maybe just useful to even just to zoom in on language, you can see the take a word like seven, right? That's a it's not completely precise, but it's pretty precise as a notion.
Hmm.
Like it's
Hmm.
quite hard to maybe in some contexts we'll use it atypically, but seven's moderately precise. Then you take a word like effervescence or love. Like these
Hmm.
are much more open-ended. Um, and in some ways, what I'm saying, what you've just glossed, is we can push beyond language to extremes. I think if we push beyond the precision, we get towards mathematics, which is hyper precise. And if we go the other way, we get towards modern art. Uh, and as I say, I think there's more than one dimension there, but the essential idea is there's a big space.
Yeah, and then just given that it's communicative, it's also then interesting to the extent that you're interested in what's being communicated, if that's your interpretation. So for me, for example, if I go to art museum in Berlin and it's about like 1930s Berlin before the Third Reich,
Yeah.
it's communicative, but it's communicative about like a past time that's really interesting for me to think about because then you're thinking about, well, what is the artist communicating and what content, and that's a way to sort of time travel to a different time or place. So
Mm.
all the things that function for communication, right? Of this is a different human with a different experience talking about or describing a different time or experience. Those things are opened up to the extent that that's what you and how you interpret it.
Yeah, I agree with that, but you can go further, and you can include not just the painter of those paintings as an expressive agent, but also the curator of the exhibition.
Mm.
And they're both expressive agents with their own goals who are trying to raise the manifestness of certain representations and ideas and histories for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even just the actual, and not even the cure, but everyone who was producing the thing, like, the Michelangelo David, like the story about like the granite stone, or like even any artifact, right? Like just thinking about, like, I like the idea of like learning about like where, like I have this like ceramic coffee mug, like made in France. And like the idea that it was like made in some foundry with like a salts or sand cast in France, like, and just thinking about that makes me appreciate this cup more. Like there's something about art as a species, like, to represent an artifact as like the causal history of what led to it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm wondering if the vagueness, for lack of a better term, or the difficulty of figuring out the meaning of a work of art is kind of a
Mm,
design feature. That if it
absolutely.
were all very upfront and on the surface and easy to decipher, then like there would be no pleasure
No.
in looking at it. The joy is trying to solve the puzzle, and maybe there isn't a correct answer, and that maybe that's part of the pleasure we get out of it. I don't know. Do you think that there's something about the mysteriousness of a work of art that is appealing to us?
I don't know about if mysteriousness is the right word, but openness definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, there needn't be a definitive interpretation, and this connects to. I mean, maybe I should. I think I should have said this already, but well, one of the innovations, Kate's innovations in this paper, is to connect this cognitive approach to human communication with ideas that come from classical art theory, very famously Danto and Dickey, and the idea that what is art is nothing more than making. They used it, I forget exactly who it is, but making special. I think that may be de
Mm,
Sennecke, who's an anthropologist. But so there's the anthropology, there's the art theory, and there's also the cognitive approaches to relevance and communication. All of them are saying you make something in some way attention grabbing, or you raise expectations of relevance of if you engage with this, you'll get something back out of it. That's what we do in the ordinary communication, but it's also what's distinctive about art. It's arguably what distinguishes art from aesthetics. It's saying
mm.
Right.
this is worth engaging with in some way. But exactly what a given audience takes away, obviously in the case of art, I think it can be very open and can be very different across different people, and that's totally fine.
Right. And something that's really understudied about this is the immense social consequences that occur if you violate these principles of relevance. So if I am chatting with you and I say something that's completely irrelevant or indecipherable, you're going to view me as a bad social partner. You're probably not going to like me very much. You're not going to want to hang out with me again. In a highly interdependent species such as Homo sapiens, that would be an immense cost. If I'm bad at language or bad at
Yeah.
communicating or bad at reading between the lines, that's pretty close to a death sentence for me.
Yeah.
So what I like about tying language to these social challenges is that it really raises the salience of the fitness implications of being able to do this stuff well versus doing it poorly. And you could imagine this also mattering from a sexual selection perspective. A huge part of mating is just talking with someone and seeing if you vibe and if you're good at communicating and coordinating with one another. Like people say that sense of humor is like a really important part of what they're looking for in a mate. If you talk to someone and the conversation isn't good, like that's over. That's it, right? And so you could imagine this stuff having huge Darwinian implications. So I'm wondering if you've thought about that aspect of your work, if you've maybe thought about trying to test some of those implications socially.
Yeah. So uh, the Darwin a key insight. So in the expression unleashed paper, which we talked about
Mhm.
earlier, one of Christoph's key insights contributions to that paper is to oversimplify a bit. Every time you try and communicate, every time you behave ostensively, you draw someone's attention, you are making a commitment, and you're making a commitment to the relevance, to the worthwhile of engagement with
Mm.
for the other person.
Mhm.
Like to draw someone's attention is to announce that it's worth their engaging with. And if it
Mhm.
turns out that they engage with it and they don't get anything out of it, then that's going to, as you say, come with social costs for you. And
Mhm.
that fact is, we think, a very important selection pressure in the evolution of the cognitive capacities that we're talking about. That's
Mhm.
why modern humans, I say, I don't mean modernity as in since the 1800s. I mean living humans. Uh,
60,000, yeah.
yeah, exactly. We just presume that what others do is optimally relevant because it had to have been in the distant past, and so our cognitive apparatus have been selected to just take it that way. And of course, that can then be exploited, or things can go wrong by people who say things which aren't worth paying any attention to, and so on. But that I don't think you can understand the design of human communication without that perspective that there's a commitment to relevance on behalf of everybody who ever talks. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
there's a passage. I mean, actually, like this is from the paper. It will hence be an informer's own interest to actually be relevant for their audience, because those who intentionally attract attention but fail to do so in ways that are useful or relevant will in time incur costs to their reputation and lose their capacity to manipulate their conspecific's attention. In other words, there will be selection for behaviors that intentionally attract others' attention only when it is likely to be worthwhile for the audience to indeed pay attention.
Precisely. Yeah. Yeah.
That's fascinating. Have you thought much about like this idea of being an attention seeker and
Mm.
why we view that
Mm,
negatively? And just in general, the idea of intention as a limited resource that we often compete over. I mean, you could
Mm.
think, cognitive scientists tell us we can only keep like seven or so things in working memory at a time. That is, in effect, a limited resource. And you could imagine other people in the social world competing for access to those seven slots, and they're limited. If I'm paying attention to you, I'm not paying attention to someone else. If I'm helping you, I'm not helping someone else. If I'm listening to you, I'm not listening to someone else. And so attention really is a evolutionarily relevant resource that you could imagine competition over. And you could imagine, huge reputational costs if I try to greedily hoard attention without providing anything of value in return. Because if I grab other people's attention, I'm preventing people from paying attention to other things. And so have you thought about that aspect of your work?
Yeah. So attention is plainly super, super basic. All organisms have to do it in some
Yeah.
way, right? Um, it's very important, I think, to distinguish. So the questions that I've been most engaged with, and certainly the work we've been talking about so far is concerned with, is um, how communication even works in the first place, which does turn
Mhm.
on attention and relevance and commitments and so on.
Mhm.
Once
Yeah,
it's up, once it's working and it's running and everybody has these basic cognitive capacities, it's part of the ordinarily developing phenotype of humans. It's true. Some people draw attention and just too much. Some
yeah.
people actually do the opposite and they draw attention too little. Not
Hmm.
as many of them, but there are a few.
Yeah.
Um,
well, there are maybe
uh,
a lot, we just don't notice them.
or
Yeah.
Yeah.
possibly so. Yeah. Speak up. Speak up.
Mhm.
I don't think I have too much insightful to say about the personalities that demand too much attention relative to what they actually have to offer. I think that's a slightly, I mean, that's clearly an interesting question, but it's a slightly different one to the ones I've been focused on. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, you could imagine there are trade-offs there which would create, balancing selection or,
Yeah.
a variety of different phenotypes that hit different ends of the trade-off. Yeah.
Absolutely. It
Yeah.
strikes me as much as anything about as a personality question rather than a
Yeah.
cognition of communication
Yeah.
question.
That
Mm.
makes sense.
One question, and I just thought of this is like there's kids are often go through a transition period of becoming very shy.
Mm.
And I was just thinking through, like, I think one of the claims of this is that the systems involved should sort of intrinsically understand that attention is important and of value, and drawing attention without it paying off for the
Mm.
other is a will be a cost to you, and to be careful about drawing attention. I mean, there's other things too, right? Like,
Mm.
but that's, I wonder, I'm just thinking out loud about the idea that part of shyness or not wanting to seek attention is in some sense an acknowledgement kind of baked into the system that attention is a really powerful but also sort of dangerous thing to elicit in others.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's part of the same box of personality questions.
Mm,
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I love that idea. I've been thinking about that a lot because I've been thinking about alliances and how
Yeah.
witch hunts are a kind of alliance where we form an alliance to accuse someone else of witchcraft, which um, which deflects blame off of us, and so
Mm.
that's the benefit we gain from participating in the witch hunt. But you could, but if we're in the middle of a witch hunt, you definitely do not want to be the center of everyone's attention because if you are, that creates a really nice focal point for everyone else to target you.
Mm.
In the witch
right,
hunt.
right.
And so you could imagine there being benefits to being the center of attention, but also really big potential costs, really big risks. It's a kind of risky strategy.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
and
Aaron
so,
Lukashevsky, like the costs and benefits of extroversion, right? Like this
Right.
was an early HB paper from a bit
mhm,
ago. Yeah.
Mm.
yeah. Um, well, I want to transition into one of my favorite papers of yours, which is non-evolutionary psychology
Oh,
possible?
Yeah. With Dan Nettle.
Um,
Yeah.
with Dan Nettle, we should also probably have on at some point. He
Yeah. Yeah.
does great work. So I will just ask you the question: is non-evolutionary psychology possible?
not really, no. Again, I should give credit where it's due. I mean, it's that Daniel's paper first, and he invited me
Okay.
on. to join because he felt I had some useful things to say about Bayesianism and other approaches to doing psychology, which are sometimes contrasted with evolutionary psychology,
Mhm.
um, but yet seems to me certainly to have similar goals to evolutionary psychology. And and so yeah, as you say, the question, okay, I mean, it's a very Daniel thing to do to sort of invert the world. Everybody says, well, evolutionary psychology, is that a good idea? Do I believe in that? Blah, blah, blah. And you've talked about that in some of your past podcast episodes. Where you can invert the question and say, well, is anybody doing non-evolutionary psychology? Is that even possible? And to answer that, we sort of delineate different commitments of different types of psychology. Um, and it's true, there are different varieties of evolutionary psychology. There are especially strong forms that have particular commitments to certain architecture of the mind.
Mhm.
But to be properly non-evolutionary, you don't just have to drop that, you have to drop notions of mechanism and notions of function. And you end up with
Mhm.
something that's so diluted that it's very hard to imagine anyone could possibly believe in it. Um, you know,
Mhm.
I mean, yeah, I think one of my go-to examples for a lot of thinking about evolution is vision science. Um,
Mhm.
some people say vision science is an evolutionary psychology, and I would say yes, it is, because vision scientists all have an assumption about the function of the mechanisms. I mean, they assume that the mechanisms exist, that there
Mhm.
are aspects of the mind that do certain jobs, and they make an assumption about the function of those mechanisms, or maybe they think it's byproducts or whatever. Um, to do non-evolutionary psychology is to drop those assumptions. And it's hard to know how I could even study vision if I didn't have those assumptions, or for that matter, personality or language or whatever else it is that you want to study. Um, and yeah, so we worked through a few examples. Bayesian cognitive science is one. And Daniel went and read some sociology of famous sociologists called Anthony Giddens, who's got a sort of a tacit theory of psychology on which he builds his sociological theories. And we make the argument that even here, this tacit theory, it does have basic notions that that in some sense make it evolutionary because they assume functions.
Mhm.
And to our mind, the only innovation of Tooby and Cosmides and other evolutionary psychologists is to say, well, when we think about these topics, we should take the evolutionary ecologies of humans. We should take that in mind. That's part of theorizing properly about functions and mechanisms. That's to my mind the basic innovation of evolutionary psychology, and I think it's got to be right. And there's an important sense in which all psychologists are evolutionary psychologists.
Yeah, I mean, maybe one argument, maybe to put it is, and you can tell me if this is right, is that everything is implicitly evolutionary psychology, and
Yeah,
what practically evolutionary psychology has been doing it explicitly,
that's true. Yep.
right?
Yeah.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah. So like a big way of thinking that's popular in social psychology and even
uh,
other branches of psychology is to view the functions of the mind in terms of the pursuit of hedonic states.
yeah.
So the pursuit of happiness. So the function of this is to make us feel good, or it's to avoid negative feelings, to avoid feelings of uncertainty or anxiety or whatever, or to pursue feelings of happiness or meaning or self-esteem or self-worth. And so you could think of a large part of current psychological research as making the implicit claim that the mind is designed to seek out certain hedonic states. And I could get on my soapbox now, but if you think about that functional claim for even a brief moment in terms of natural selection, it makes absolutely no sense. Why would the mind be designed to seek out something inside itself? What why do brains want stuff inside our brains? We should have evolved to seek stuff in the world that mattered for ancestral survival and reproduction, and we should care about the degree to which our beliefs about those things are correct or not correct, right? We shouldn't want to just feel good for its own sake. We should want to get the sorts of things that would have enhanced survival and reproduction, like food, sex, status, group cohesion, things of that sort,
Mm.
that have a real covariance with biological fitness.
Yeah.
But seeking out happiness itself is not a very plausible functional claim. And so you could think of a huge part of psychology as making this implicit evolutionary theory that we have evolved to seek happiness. And that theory is just, it shouldn't have ever left the gate. It's just a completely implausible theory on its face. And if psychologists had taken a brief moment to evaluate the evolutionary plausibility of their theory, they would realize that it should never have left the gate. And it has, in my opinion, led to a lot of really bad, for lack of a better term, research, or a lot of going down blind alleys and in wrong directions and thinking about the mind in exactly the wrong way. There's a leading theory of conspiracy theories that they're designed to make us feel better, to assuage feelings of uncertainty about the world, which makes absolutely no sense. Especially, considering that most conspiracy theories are quite horrifying, and that would seem to serve the function of making you feel better quite poorly. And so, what I love about your paper is that it it tells anyone who's studying the mind that you're already doing evolutionary psychology. You're studying an evolved organ. If you believe in the theory of evolution, if you believe that the human brain slash mind is a product of evolution, and you're studying it, um, what else are you doing but studying an evolved organ? And if you're making claims about that evolved organ, you are necessarily making evolutionary psychological claims. And so if you're going to be making those claims, you might as well do your homework and think about how evolution works, think about the evolutionary history of Homo sapiens, and do the job well. Um, so
I mean, no, I can't disagree, obviously. I mean, I
yeah,
agree with all that. There's a point in that
yeah,
paper that's worth making in this context, though.
no,
I think that evolutionary psychology, the field, has been misnamed from the beginning.
hmm,
I think the name mislead. So a lot of people think, oh no, and you're as or more familiar than I am with the many criticisms and misunderstandings of evolutionary psychology.
yeah,
What it really is adaptationist cognitive science.
Yeah.
So it's
yeah,
saying,
Yeah, yeah, I love
you-
yeah, yeah. Cognitive adaptationism in my mind is actually what it is. Cognitive
yeah,
adaptationism is my actual word for it. Yeah.
to 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 think seriously about the evolutionary ecology of human minds, as you were just saying, David,
mhm,
uh, in our framing of our hypotheses about how the mind works, that is to be an adaptationist about cognitive science, and hence why I think it's best understood as adaptationist cognitive science. It's called evolutionary psychology, and I think that leads people to think that we evolutionary psychologists are trying to recreate the evolutionary history of humans. Um, we're interested in the phylogeny question, which certainly is an interesting question, but it's not the defining question of the field, I think, which is an adaptation and functionalist and function and mechanism questions.
mhm,
And I think yeah, and I suppose the evolutionary psychology framing also sort of places an emphasis or can for some readers place an emphasis on basic biological things and leading to the contrast with culture, leading to the contrast with learned. You've talked in other podcast episodes about how
yeah.
those are false dichotomies, but then I don't think the name does us any favors in that respect.
Right. Yeah. And
Yeah.
it's also, I mean, everything is sort of it's a convention, right? And sort of a
Yeah,
function of its
yeah,
time. And even on this podcast, like we will actually have a ton of anthropologists on, not all of whom are cognitive adaptationists. And the
no,
evolutionary behavioral sciences are a bit different than just cognitive adaptationism. And of course, you want to understand what is if you're doing an adaptationism of like what does this organism or organ need, what does this brain need, understanding the natural ecology, understanding selection pressures and game theory, evolutionary game theory, these are all related tools. And so I think I totally agree with you, Tom. And I think like even just the language of sort of like, well, is evolutionary psychology or like the overarching thing, or is it evolutionary behavioral sciences, or what does that even mean? And then like, where do all these things fit in? And, like lots of people like Dan Conroy Beam does like agent-based modeling selection dynamics, but then also is a cognitive adaptationist, but like does the modeling stuff actually is that cognitive adaptationism? Well, no, but it's part of the toolkit of being that, so it's all, yeah, it's a sort of a fuzzy set. Yeah.
yeah. Another reason you should get Daniel Nettle on is I know he's done empirical work getting people's folk intuitions about what explains human behavior, and he
Yes,
constantly gets this division between
exactly. Yeah.
evolution and biology on one side and
Yeah.
culture on the other side, and
Yeah,
so on.
and that's part of this difference
Oh,
detecting
yeah,
mechanisms,
yeah,
which is part of like my idea, my
absolutely.
thinking too. I want to push on this idea that, and we can transition maybe to something else, which is related to what we were just talking about, which is that, cognitive science or areas of psychology that are already sort of implicitly evolutionary but
Mm.
they're doing this thing. And I'm going to characterize this thing, and I'm going to be slightly uncharitable, but it's something I think all three of us have been kind of brushed against, or has been kind of ground us down. And I think it's worth talking about. And it's basically, to put it in a really uncharitable, brief way, is that one of the problems of our science is, and it goes back to this Chomsky thing, is the data is really important. And the exercise of a science of psychology, because like Marvin Minsky talked about, it's like physics envy. Um,
Oh,
which is, and even Chomsky
Mm.
was like, calling
Yeah.
behavioral science like the science of behavior. It's like this calling physics, or, the science of meter reading, right? It's not the data don't matter. It's what you're making a theory about. I think there's such in cognitive science, in social psychology, in a lot of areas, and I think psych is an exception. There are other exceptions, broadly, but there are generally, it's this idea that if you're doing good science, you're producing lots of data. And then maybe as a secondary thing, you describe the data or characterize the data. And what you're really not allowed to do is really say very much to the extent that you don't have data. And I think that even this point about like what David described as sort of like people are motivated to be happy, it's typically like what's done. And David, you can tell me if this is incorrect, but this is my assessment, is that in all of these areas that we sort of think aren't going very well, I believe that the bottom line thing is not appreciation of like theory first approaches, or thinking about what should we expect to find, what data is important. And instead it's saying, I'm going to study people's satisfaction or self-esteem or happiness about this important, interesting thing of life. Like I'm going to look people at social media use. Do people who use social media, are they happier or less happy? And then like the idea that's sort of like implicit in it is like there's a mechanism that's motivated to like be happy, is sort of incidental, because the implicit game is I get status by presenting data. And the more hard it
Mhm.
is, the more interesting it, quote unquote, interesting it is, and the more, the bigger the n, the bigger the sample size, the more geographically diverse it is, that gets me a science or nature paper. And really the theory or the inference about the mind is very much secondary. So I would say it's even worse than like implicit of psych. It's almost like there's no psychology at all. Like the Virginia Woolf thing
Yeah.
is like, why are psychologists afraid to do psychology? I will say this, like I really feel like there's so much of psychology that's afraid to like make claims about what's in the mind. I'm curious what you guys think about that as sort of being a problem.
you want me to go, or do you want to go, David?
Go for it, Tom.
Um, I mean, yeah, there's so much to say. I mean, in some ways, I think your characterization of the current landscape is a sociology of science point you're making, and your characterization, I basically agree with. I haven't put it, I haven't thought about it quite in those terms. Why psychologists are afraid to do psychology, but I do rather like that. One thing that I've written about recently, as you know, is that if you call yourself a theoretical psychologist, it's extremely hard to get a job. To the extent, I mean, psychologists don't know what that is. Like that category
Yeah.
doesn't exist in the world. They say,
Yeah,
"Oh, do you mean philosophy?" And there's there's one group of people who never ask me that question, and that's philosophers. They don't confuse the sort of work I do for philosophy.
right.
Um, but psychologists often call me a philosopher, interestingly. I think, I mean, exactly what is going on, why things are the way they are, and how they might change, that's almost a question for historians. So I think it actually to ties in with the way we fund science and the way we fund universities even, and the way that, and the accountancy of universities, and therefore the way that grants are incentivized and treated. And I think as the prioritization of data. I mean, clearly data is huge. Obviously it's important, um, but as you say, arguably it goes so far that we don't actually do psychology. And why that's the case, I think, is that's a really complicated sociological question.
Yeah. No, I think the physics envy is probably a big part of it. That we want to try to mimic the superficial features of a rigorous science without, getting to the core of what good science actually is. That it's not just about the superficial appearances, the numbers, the data, the graphs. It's about actual insight, actual understanding. And I think we've lost sight of that. It is interesting how you can get a job as a theoretical physicist. A theoretical
Yeah,
physicist makes sense as a profession. There are plenty of theoretical physicists who make a living doing that, but the idea of a theoretical psychologist is unheard of.
I wonder if we got a theoretical, if we spoke to theoretical physicists and what they would say about the funding landscape and therefore the job landscape for theoretical physicists. They definitely do
Yeah,
exist
maybe,
in a category, but I wouldn't be surprised if there is that they complain about the challenges
Mm.
of
that's true. Yeah, it may be a problem in physics too, but it at least is probably less of a problem
yeah,
for them
yeah,
than it is for us. It's even worse
yeah.
in psychology, which I think it gets it exactly backwards. If anything, we need more theory in psychology because our object of study is so much more
Absolutely,
complicated with so many different interacting variables
absolutely.
there's just an even greater need for theory to make sense of it because there's just an endless variety of empirical tests and hypotheses that you could
Yeah,
test, and just winnowing down that space of possibilities to a manageable number is just way more important in psychology because just the possibility of going down blind alleys is just so much greater. So
yeah,
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you can collect, it's not antithetical to data. It's that it tells you what data to collect.
yeah,
And what it does, theory, what it avoids is collecting data, which is a really expensive, time-consuming thing that doesn't
yeah,
buy you anything, you know. And so in the efficacy of sort of even what science is, like even from like a Popperian perspective, like it's an idea that's falsifiable in the sense of it's not just you recognize this thing, right? Like that, oh yeah, this is like cognitive dissonance is a great example. Like if you can't falsify the idea, it's not a really good testable prediction. And so if you can probably cash out cognitive dissonance mechanistically, so it's like a falsifiable version of it. Um, but if you don't have theory to sort of cash all that out, to then set up the data, like it would be a very different world if psychologists were all coordinated about what data needed to be collected and which data would test between
Mm.
these very clear alternative ideas. And then we eventually do the data, right? Like that's not what it looks like at all. Right now, it's sort of just like, here's some data and here's maybe what it means, right? And I feel like that we've kind of kicked the can down the road. And I do think like there's a ton of papers about the theory crisis. But Tom, I think like you are a good example of if people's intentions, like the one thing we know about evolution is that, or just the logic of selective regimes
Mm.
is that everybody can have a certain intention, right? Like I want to do something that's great, but all that matters is the selective regime. So if I as a faculty member want people who do slow quality science, but my hiring committee chooses candidates based on the number of publications, and if the number of publications is a function of like the what we talked about, just like data and just how hard it was to collect the data, your selective regime is selecting for a particular kind of science that has nothing to do with what your explicit intentions are. And so I've heard a lot of people say we should have theory. I've heard a lot of people say we should have interdisciplinarity. But is this the selective regime we've created yet?
No, yeah. So there's a lot to say. So the short answer to that question is no. But if things will change, if and when job panels and grant panels um, prioritize the sort of work that you're talking about, I mean, you're quite right. You know, it can be selected for, and that's in some ways that's why I say it's a question almost for historians or maybe sociologists. There are certain dynamics on grant panels and job panels. There's even the way universities are funded and their ethos is most recruitment happens at department level, but the university wants interdisciplinarity. That's an inherent tension, and it's very hard to tell a department we're going to do the recruitment for you for old reasons of academic freedom. So there's a lot of interacting factors that are creating barriers to the sort of selective regimes you're talking about. I want to also go back a couple of minutes to something you were saying there. And while I definitely agree with the spirit of what you're saying, I'm going to sort of speak on behalf of my friends who do the empirical science.
Yeah, I
And
do. I do empirical stuff too, for sure.
yeah, yeah. Well, of course, but
Yeah.
there are people who are collecting data for the purposes of description, and I think
hmm
Yeah.
yeah,
that particularly in the human science, in the human sciences, just good quality like data that describes what humans do at scale. Um, it needn't always have. I mean, it needn't all be
Oh, I
theory.
agree.
Just
Totally.
saying, like,
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
what
I
actually
totally
are
agree.
humans
Yeah.
doing? Yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I know you agree, but I just wanted to
No, it's worth saying out loud.
as
Yeah,
a
yeah. This
Oh, for
is,
as a
sure.
pushback.
yeah,
Yeah,
No,
yeah,
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 description is important, but
yeah.
unfortunately, we get the worst of both worlds because we don't get good theory and we don't get good description. We just get bad theory.
right,
Right.
right.
So I would love if we just had description that was just clear about the fact that it was description and they weren't trying to make theoretical claims. It was just trying to get as clear a picture of possible as of like what is going on, what are the facts on the ground. I think ethnography is really
Yeah,
valuable for
exactly.
those
Yeah.
purposes. We've had a few anthropologists on the podcast who've been incredibly illuminating. So
Yeah.
yeah, I agree that description is very valuable. It's just you have to be clear about what your goal is.
I completely.
And yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So
I completely agree. And the sad thing is that it will be quite hard to get published in a high profile psychology journal
yeah,
saying, here's an interesting thing about humans, here's what they do, or here's what they don't do, or whatever it is, full stop. You're
Yeah,
yeah.
expected to wrap that in theory.
right.
Hmm.
More theory and then in also data. So it's just sort of like, it's almost like, I appreciate Tom, your point, and I completely agree, and it's worth saying out loud. The argument isn't that like it should only be what I'm describing. It's just that there should be a role for this kind of
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
thing.
yeah,
Like
yes,
there's
yes,
no
yes.
physics is not just theoretical physics, it's also experimental, and it should not lose that part either, right? I mean,
Yeah.
and so the argument is like these different entities should be allowed to exist on their own. And the argument we're making is against the backdrop of this doesn't even exist, not that it should be the only
Yeah,
thing, for
yeah,
sure, 100%. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So Tom, this kind of might lead into, I mean, I don't know how much you want to go into this, but I'll open this up of like, I know you do a lot of theoretical work. You're very interdisciplinary, and I know you've sort of struggled a bit in terms of finding positions, which I think is just insane. And you have this recent post about sort of your experience of that, and maybe we can link that in this episode notes. Um, you know, if at all, and if you don't want to, we can even just cut this out. But is there anything you want to say sort of about that? At this point.
I mean, I wrote, I spent probably more time than I should have writing that essay.
Mm.
So what I have to say is there in a way.
Yeah.
I
Or maybe, I mean, maybe one thing to say then is just sort of like for people who haven't seen it, or sort of what
you know
service you think it might provide more broadly, aside from maybe your specifics, just sort of
yeah.
like, especially I think for people listening who don't know everything we know
Yeah.
about what it's like to be in this field and like these issues, like what's the communicative relevance at a broader level
Well,
to this? Yeah.
it's one human story of the realities of contemporary academia. I
Mm.
mean, there are as many human stories as there are academics, uh, and everybody knows that the way the sector is structured creates profound uncertainty at certain career stages, and that plays out in all sorts of different ways for different people. It intersects with country, with family planning, with home buying, with disciplines and departments, and um, plays out in all sorts of different ways. In some respects, I've been particularly unlucky. I've been lucky in a couple of respects too. Uh, but right now, I'm at a quite difficult junction, and so I just wanted to share that story
Mm.
and put a properly human,
Yeah.
edge to.
I've
I mean, everybody understands in the abstract that there's a lot of uncertainty after your PhD, but if you make it human, then maybe that can help advance the discourse.
Yeah, what's the feedback you've gotten from that, if
I
any?
mean, very, very supportive. I mean, a lot of people have got in touch and said nice things, and um, nobody's offered me a job.
Right.
Nobody responded to it saying, "Oh, well, here's an opportunity," because
Right.
Yeah.
Tom is an able scientist, and it would be great to have him here. Nobody's yet done that, and let me make it completely clear to anybody listening that those sorts of approaches are absolutely welcome. Um, that hasn't happened, but I've not really had any proper pushback on it at all.
Right.
No,
Yeah.
nobody's saying you're mischaracterizing the way things are, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So to be explicit, we do this occasionally. It's the only commercials we ever have. If you want to support Tom, please reach out to Tom directly.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
don't be reluctant, please. Yeah.
Maybe just for those that haven't read the essay, the short version is I got my PhD in linguistics in 2009. Held fellowships in my own name in linguistics in Edinburgh for a while, then in anthropology at Durham University. Then in 2017, I moved to Budapest to work on a big European Research Council project in a department of psychology on social minds. And that took me to 2021. So it's now 12 years after my PhD. Great jobs. I mean,
Yeah.
they were very good jobs, but they were always in the background was the fact that they were temporary jobs. And
Right.
I achieved a lot, I think, made some useful contributions, I hope. And then I got a post in Spain, and that did not work out for a number of reasons that I go into in detail well, not detail actually, but I outline in the essay. And so, it became clear I had to leave that job after a while. So right now, I'm financially okay for the short term, but I do need to work again.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'm back. I'm back in my apartment with my partner. It's great here. And,
Yeah.
we'll just got to work out what's next in life.
Yeah. And I just want to say, because like, I think especially for people on the outside who don't know, and I think I'm sure this will be okay to say, like, even Lita Cosmides and John Tooby struggled financially in the beginning, and
Right.
they are like one of the founders of this field, right? And so, like, I mean, Lita talked about this often, where they were like down to one salary. Annie Wirtz and I were down to one salary at one point. Like, people outside should just be clear. Like, I want to be very clear that the difficulty of this that Tom is experiencing is in no way an indication or is unique to, it's not like, it's really like objectively, like the best people in the field went through this same thing. So it's really, I just want to like clarify that for people who might not know that and who might be thinking, well, it sounds fair, but like really you wouldn't have this issue if you were actually good. And I can like, no, like that's just not true, right?
You're very kind. I think I have two weaknesses in inverted commas, and they aren't weaknesses, but they are in terms of science. But I think they are weaknesses on the job market.
Mm.
And that is that I'm not easily identifiable as a psychologist or a linguist or an anthropologist, but I'm a bit of each of them, and even philosophy. And also that I'm very theoretically minded for reasons we talked about 5 or 10 minutes ago. Those things together, the interdisciplinarity, the theoretical orientation. I think that sort of work should be. I mean, obviously, I think this. I'm biased, but I think that's hugely useful and positive for science. But it's not incentivized. It's not that individuals are out to get me or anti this agenda, but it's not. But it is the case that job panels and grant panels are not much incentivized to promote that sort of work. And I was quite slow in my career to realize that this was the case.
Mm.
Yeah, but I think it is.
I mean, so maybe just one thing to say then to transition from like the negativity to just like without sort of, I mean, assuming things could just change, like pretty simply, what would be some ways to sort of change the problem?
I mean, this is a very big and complicated question. I think just to throw out some utopian ideas, I
Yeah.
would love for there to be so many science labs. They have permanent staff who are administrators and technical staff. Those people are given permanent contracts, and
Hmm.
of course, the funding of that job is dependent on future funding streams for the university, for the lab, from the PI, and so on. But we don't give permanent jobs to scientists. Um, that you have to take on a temporary job as a postdoc and then become the head of a lab somewhere else.
Mm.
What we don't have is just a permanent research scientist, like a permanent administrator. And I think there's a lot of people who have got their PhD and they're qualified and able people who don't necessarily want to take on all the responsibilities of faculty. They want a steady income and a steady job, and they want it over the long term, and they'd be brilliant at it. And that job literally doesn't exist.
Yeah. Like I think the closest
I
thing
think it's
is
sort
like,
of mad.
yeah, the Max Planck Institute, and it's a temporary, all
Even
but
then,
one.
even then, it's temporary.
Yeah,
Yeah,
even though it's
yeah.
a long term. No, that's right. And we've talked, I mean, David and I have talked about how if you have a theoretical perspective and you want to take that on, oftentimes there's just more data than you can sort of collect, like or there's just more predictions than you can even test. And so you've got this sort of tragedy of coordination, I feel like in psychology, especially where there's people with really great methods and data, but they're sort of like in a holding pattern. And I mean, I will say this, like, dear friends of mine do this work, but like, frankly, at the end of the day, a lot of like these sophisticated methods, they're not really testing particularly sophisticated theories. There are exceptions, but
Well,
it's
that's
sort
true.
of like they're just sort of refining methods. And
Yeah,
so there's really just like a ton of people who are like good at doing methods.
yeah,
And there's people who are doing
yeah.
a good theory, and there's this coordination problem of not connecting
Completely
these
agree.
up.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing to say is So this is in some ways why I think the issues you're raising are to do with economics and accountancy to an extent. Um, it's quite revealing to me that when people get big grants, they're often celebrated, meet in the common room and announcements are made. Um, and they're often, very much in the foreground of people's CVs. I don't know why my camera's doing that.
Yeah. I have one of those too. It's kind of weird.
Yeah.
Sometimes it just does that. Yeah.
Uh, grants are celebrated, and to some extent, I understand why, but to another extent, I don't understand why, because that grants are the means. The ends is the science. The ends is the answers to questions, and we don't celebrate that. It doesn't seem to me institutionally to the same degree. So scientists have internalized that grants are a goal, not a means, but a goal.
Mm.
And I think I don't know why scientists, well, I have a hypothesis about why scientists have internalized that. And that's because it's incentivized at the career level, because the university
Yeah.
wants the grants, because the university needs the grants to pay for the debt that was incurred when it built the building in which you're doing the work, right? So, and I don't have enough expertise in finance and accountancy and so on to detail that argument. But it does strike me that the way universities finance themselves and their infrastructure feeds into the incentive structure that acts on academics, which means that they prioritize grants rather than answers. And that has a downstream effect that theoreticians are less valued than empiricists.
Yeah. So
Because
the idea,
theory is cheap. So you would think cheap and brilliant would be valued, but it's not,
right.
right?
Yes.
Expensive and brilliant is what's most valued.
Yeah. And there's also this weird thing of like, so if we want to make fun, like fundraising, we'll do a lottery, right?
Yeah.
Because the lottery is lots of people put their money in, and only a small number of people actually get the valued thing. And so what that is a really efficient way to sort of like multiply the contribution of each individual and actually minimize the cost you have to incur. Now flip that. That is what writing grants and contract, like
Yes.
applying for grants are.
Grants is
And
so
John Tooby once described this as, and I know there's empirical work on this, is like if aliens wanted to design a system to waste scientists' time as much as possible, what it currently is would be, he was like, this might be evidence of aliens who don't want us to learn anything, because there's exactly this thing of, so you have a competition, which is like a lottery. So a ton of people all use their time to apply for something only a small number of people have. So you've multiplied the cost
yeah.
and you have a minimal benefit. It's exactly the structure you would want to maximize the time cost of scientists for minimal benefits. It's exactly as an institutional structure, the exact worst way to uh, give resources to scientists.
I know there are some funding bodies that are experimenting with actual lotteries, and
Mm,
I find that quite an interesting innovation. So it's much cheaper to enter. You've got to
yeah,
pass the threshold. You've got to be a scientist of a certain caliber with a certain background,
yeah,
so sufficient expertise. But after that, just
yeah,
this is good enough, and then we'll throw out the lottery,
yeah,
and some people get it. And if that's available to all eligible scientists, we'll all get it once in 5, once in 10.
right, yeah.
Yeah.
And there are other things like I think like Templeton does a good job of like minimal effort up
Yeah.
front, unless and so I like there are sensible ways to do it. But I've often thought like I wonder too like, and I kind of hate to say this, but I will say this like how much of it is the ego of the funding agencies, where it's sort of like people are coming to me and it feels really good, as opposed to really like. And maybe this could be gamed, but like funding agencies going out and like finding out like who do people think is doing the best work. And I mean,
Mm.
that can be gamed, but
Mm.
it's a very different way of sort of approaching it, which is sort of like I'm not going to take up their time. I'm going to like observe this community and see who could use the funding,
Yeah.
as opposed to having people come to me. And maybe that's naive, but that's a very different way to think about how to send resources to people.
Yeah. I'm certain that all sectors have challenges like this. And we're not privy to the ones that are going on in journalism
Yeah,
or
sure. Yeah,
other
yeah,
sectors.
yeah,
But I'm sure,
exactly.
I mean, everybody knows the dynamics are off. Nobody has the perfect solution yet.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah, I mean, so is there anything we should have asked you?
Oh, you should ask me about the history of Lindy Hop.
Okay, yes, I actually did want to. So please, yes, in my cartoon bubble of view, ostensive communication and Lindy Hop are next to each other. So please tell us about these.
I've listened to your past podcast, so I knew this question was
Yeah,
coming.
good.
So
I know. Yeah, the
and
first time
I
we
said
had
to my
yes.
partner, I
Yeah.
said to my partner, when he asked me that, I'm going to tell him to ask me about the history of Lindy Hop.
Fantastic. Okay, good. So please go ahead.
Lindy Hop is a swing dance, partner dance, created in African American communities in Harlem, well, in several places, but in particular Harlem, New York, in the 1920s and the 1930s. And it has a fascinating history, both in that original era, and then fewer people are dancing it through the 50s and the 60s and 70s, still some. And then it globalizes in the 80s and 90s. And today it was all over America in the late 30s and the 40s. It was the first pop music essentially.
Mm.
And then, as I say, other music, you know, what music is like. It changes and fashions change and so on. So it fades a bit more into the background, and then it globalizes in the 80s and 90s. And now there are little communities all over the world dancing the Lindy Hop. Strangely, by far the biggest, apparently, is in Seoul in Korea. There are large communities in random places. And obviously, most big cities have sizable communities. Yeah, and there's one in Budapest, and I dance there. I'm giving a talk this time next week, I think, on the history of Lindy Hop, where I will talk much more about
Nice.
its origins in the 20s and 30s in New York in particular. I think it's very much connected to the advent of modernity and the machine age and the way that they transformed the landscape and the economic opportunities, particularly of African Americans. And what they do in response to that is a huge cultural moment that's sometimes called the Harlem Renaissance,
Mm.
which has many dimensions. It's books, it's theatre, it's poetry, it's political activism, and it's also music. And music leads to the dancing. And there's much to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, just in a really short amount, like, is there something? Because I think like a lot of people think, well, like dancing, you like dancing, and it's sort of incidental that you chose this kind. Is that true, or is there something about this kind that is what is it about that
I always wanted to dance, like partner dance. I didn't know how to as a 20-year-old, say. And I tried a few salsa lessons that did not bite. And then I went to a dance class, swing dance. I did not know what swing dance was, but that did bite. And I think it's not a coincidence. If you understand uh, the sociology of the dance, where it comes from, and what's physically built into the technique of the dance, I think it's not a surprise that today's dancers are liberals, is one thing to say. I think it's not a surprise that they're globalized individuals. I think that those values are built into the physical apparatus of the dance.
Hmm.
And so I didn't know what I was going into when I went into it, but I found something that very much fitted with my values and my identity, my self-identity. And the fact that it's now globalized raises interesting and difficult questions. Say, a lot, I'm very, very educated. The demographic has a high degree of education relative to the general population. That's not good or bad. That's just a fact of the matter. And so today, most dancers are not African Americans, and that's a difficult fact for given its origins, which is absolutely in the African American communities. And it comes, I think, in some ways, it goes back to the experience of exiting slavery relatively recently, rural environments in the South, and then suddenly the younger generation are in a completely new modern world in the northern cities after the Great Migration. And it's absolutely an African American story, and yet today most people who dance it are highly educated white people. I don't think that's inherently problematic, but it does. I think it places responsibilities on us as contemporary dancers to educate new dancers and to keep that history in mind, because otherwise, I think you change the dance, and then in some respects, if you change the dance too much, you disrespect the origins of the dance.
And just in terms of like itself compared to other things, it's just very acrobatic but very coordinated in the sense, or like I don't know, how would you characterize
Yeah. So I think there's a lot. The best thing to do is to Google it, but the next
Yeah.
thing. So it's a dance that is two things at once. So you do it together, but you also have individual freedom. So it's I'd say somewhat unlike say the foxtrot, for example, which is sort of one four-legged dance thing that's very coordinated, and the skill is being very coordinated as a four-legged dance thing. In the Lindy Hop, you're very clearly dancing with someone else, and you're coordinated, but both individuals are encouraged to be self-expressive at the same time. And doing both those things, coordinating and being self-expressive, that's an advanced skill. It's thrilling to do. When it goes well, it's completely thrilling. And in some respects, I think it's true. I don't know if it's taking the point too far, but you can also see, you can almost see it as being, true to the values of America in some respects.
Right.
There's an individual freedom, but there's also a recognition of collective responsibility. I mean, Wynton Marsalis, a very famous jazz musician, has spoken a fair bit and written a fair bit about how jazz embodies some of the principles of the American Constitution, and I think and swing in particular embodies some of the principles of the American Constitution, and I think you see that in the dance itself.
That's fantastic. That's great. Well, I think you also, Thom, embody coordination, but also autonomy, and I do think. I mean, this might be slightly, but I think, you said the Harlem Renaissance. I do think there's sort of a scientific renaissance happening in the evolutionary behavioral sciences,
Let's hope so.
or psychology, behavioral sciences anyway. And I do think, Thom, for your part, you are one of the people kind of, doing some of the work that's moving that. And I hope number one, genuinely, as David said, your work, it is relevant, and people have attention on you. And I hope that,
Thanks.
I hope that, the story, stories, real life doesn't always work out, but I hope this is an instance where things do work out. But I do want to say thank you, and your work is really incredible. Please keep doing what you're doing, and if people are listening, please reach out to Thom and support him.
It's my pleasure to be here. I was very thrilled when I saw the podcast, on the social media feeds, and that you guys are doing this. People should like and subscribe, as they say.
Oh, thanks. That we couldn't have said it better ourselves. David, do you have any final words?
Yeah, just really great to talk to you. I hope to have you on again at some point. And you've shaped my own thinking a lot about communication and signaling, and given me some mental tools that have been very useful. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. So if you are part of a funding agency or academic coordination institution, think about things, maybe reach out to Thom, and then everybody should go check out the Lindy Hop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you're in, I don't know when you're releasing this to the world, but if you're in Budapest on next Tuesday, it's the 8th, I'm giving a talk about the history of the Lindy Hop at 6 p.m.
We'll be well past that. But that's great. But Thom will post your website and things like that. But thanks so much for being on, and it was
my
great.
pleasure.
Well, David, aside from looking into the Lindy Hop, what can people do to now that we're done with this episode, going forward, aside from listening to the next one?
Well, they can like us, they can subscribe to our podcast, they can leave us a kind review, they can visit our Patreon page and support us there. They can say nice things about us on social media. They can mention to a friend, hey, I'm listening to this cool podcast called Evolutionary Psychology, the podcast. Those are just some of the things that people can do to support us.
Should we get t-shirts?
Yeah. Sure, I'd wear a t-shirt, maybe a hat, maybe a fanny pack.
Okay. We can, if people have ideas about swag to put.
Yeah, if you have swag ideas, we're open to feedback. Maybe tell us if you'd prefer a fanny pack or a hat or maybe some underwear. The sky's the limit.
David, do you need a fanny pack? Should somebody just send you a fanny pack? It sounds like you need a fanny pack.
I could really use a fanny pack. I've been looking far and wide for the best fanny pack. I've been reading fanny pack reviews.
I can tell.
I'm really trying to make a good purchase.
So if you know of a good fanny pack, just we'll send David an email, or the podcast we'll send you the mailing address.
That would really help me out.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Good. All well, on that note, we'll see you next week.
See you next week.